The bells rang for the last time before anyone in the convent knew which names would still be remembered by morning. They rang over the hills of Thessaly at dusk, where olive trees bent under an autumn wind and the last light moved across stone walls worn by centuries of prayer. Inside the chapel, 22 Orthodox nuns knelt beneath cracked frescoes. The painted saints above them had faded with smoke, weather, and age, but their eyes still seemed to watch the room as candles trembled below. The women heard the bells, then the horses, then the far sound of men calling to one another on the road. At first, no one moved. The youngest among them, Sister Magdalena, held a strip of prayer cloth between her fingers so tightly that the thread cut into her skin. She had taken her vows only months before. She remembered the convent kitchen before dawn, the smell of warm bread, the old stone oven, the soft scrape of sandals in the corridor. World had seemed small. By sunset, it seemed like the whole world. Beyond the outer wall, Ottoman banners appeared on the hill road like red sparks against the darkening sky. This was the late 15th century, after Constantinople had fallen and the old Byzantine world had broken into fragments. Orthodox villages, mountain monasteries, and hidden convents still survived across the former Christian lands of the East. But the power that ruled the region now came from the Ottoman court. It arrived with soldiers, tax registers, officials, translators, and scribes. It did not always need to destroy a place with fire. Sometimes it conquered more completely by changing the names of the people inside it. According to later accounts, this convent was one of the places where that darker conquest began. If you are drawn to the darker corners of history, subscribe to grimhistory and help us reach 45,000 subscribers. Every story here is built to uncover the past with atmosphere, tension, and respect for the lives history tried to bury. That evening, the nuns did not yet know how many of them would die, how many would vanish, or how many would be carried into records that never to keep their names. They knew only that the bells were no longer calling them to prayer. They were warning them that the world outside the gate had arrived. Sister Eleni of Larissa, the abbess of the convent, was already old when the banners appeared. Her hands were narrow, browned by years of work in the garden and kitchen, but they did not shake when she rose from the chapel floor. A small silver crucifix hung beneath her dark veil. It was not large enough to impress anyone. It had no jewels, no gold casing, no royal inscription, but it had been kissed by dying sisters, carried through famine, hidden during raids, and passed from abbess to abbess like a small piece of the convent's soul. She looked at the women kneeling before her and understood what military force would do to stone. The convent had no army. Its gate was made for shepherds and pilgrims, not siege. Its walls had been built to keep out wolves, thieves, and winter wind. They would not hold against armed men. No messenger had returned from the nearest village. No local lord had sent riders. Smoke was already rising from the lower valley, where the roofs of homes had begun to darken against the evening sky. So Eleni did not promise rescue. She gave the sisters something smaller and harder. If you cannot hold the cross, she told them, hold each other. The words passed through the chapel quietly. Magdalena heard them and lifted her head. Sister Damaris, one of the eldest nuns, closed her eyes as if she were committing the sentence to memory, before memory itself became dangerous. The convent moved quickly after that, not in panic but in a kind of disciplined grief. Icons were lifted from walls, a chalice was wrapped in rough linen. Prayer books were gathered from the reading room. Fragments of relics, too small and plain to tempt a collector, were placed beneath a loosened stone near the altar. The women worked by candlelight, hiding what they could not defend. Outside, the sound of hooves grew closer. The first blow against the outer gate came before the last prayer was finished. Wood cracked. A second blow followed, then a third. Somewhere in the courtyard, a mule screamed and broke its tether. Smoke rolled over the wall. A horn sounded from the road, sharp and foreign against the bells. The sisters did not see the full violence of the entry. They heard it in splintering timber, boots on stone, shouted orders, and the sudden silence of birds leaving the roof. When the gate gave way, Ottoman soldiers entered the convent courtyard. They were not demons from a tale. They were men under command, wrapped in layered coats and turbans, with leather belts, boots dusted by the road, curved blades at their sides, and spears in their hands that made them more frightening, not less. They moved like people performing a task already decided before they arrived. The captain walked behind them. He was cold with the authority of someone who had been told exactly what the conquest of a sacred house meant. Sacred buildings were not merely shelters. They were symbols. A convent taken by force was not only a military success. It was a message to every village that still believed the mountains might protect them. The chapel doors were forced open. Smoke entered the nave. Candles were knocked from stands. A painted panel fell and struck the floor face down. The sisters were brought into the courtyard one by one, their dark veils streaked with ash, their sandals slipping in mud and spilled oil. Magdalena searched for the bells and saw the rope hanging loose. No one pulled it now. The abbess was brought forward last. The captain noticed the silver crucifix at her chest. He looked at it as a man might look at a seal on a document that needed to be broken. Through a translator, he offered her what he called mercy. She would renounce publicly. She would speak the words. The women would see. The convent would become a lesson without further ruin. Eleni stood in the courtyard with smoke moving behind her. Her voice was quiet enough that the translator had to lean closer. "I gave my life to God before you arrived," she said. "You cannot take what is no longer mine." The captain's face did not change. That was what Magdalena remembered most. Not rage, not surprise. Only the blankness of power when it meets a conscience it cannot understand. The convent burned behind them. Some sisters were struck down in the confusion of the fall, though later accounts are careful, broken, and incomplete. Others survived because they were useful. And here the first meaning of the title began to reveal itself. A dead nun could frighten a village for one day. A broken nun could serve as proof forever. The soldiers bound the surviving women together and pulled them from the courtyard. The old life ended not with a final hymn, but with rope around wrists and the smell of wet ashes in their hair. Behind them, the chapel roof glowed in the dark. Ahead of them, the road to the coast waited. The march to Volos took the surviving sisters through villages that had already learned the discipline of fear. Doors closed before the soldiers arrived. Shutters were drawn. Men stood behind walls and did not lift their eyes. Women pulled children indoors. No one called out to the nuns. No one offered water where the guards could see. The people on the road knew what Magdalena did not yet understand. Empire did not need everyone to agree. It only needed enough people to be afraid in silence. The sisters walked in their scorched robes, bound in pairs. Dust gathered at the hems of their veils. Their feet bled into worn sandals, but the narration of later memory does not dwell there, because their worst suffering was not the body's pain. It was the way the world began to behave, as if they had already disappeared. At one bend in the road, Magdalena stumbled. Sister Eleni, older and weaker, could not reach her. Sister Damaris did. She shifted her bound hands, lifted the young woman by the elbow, and whispered the abbess's words. "If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other." By the time they reached Volos, the sea had become a wall. The port was crowded with grain sacks, barrels, ropes, sailors, pack animals, merchants, prisoners, and officials who seemed more interested in counting than seeing. Names were spoken, then altered, then abandoned. The scribe sat near a stack of goods with a reed pen and parchment register. He wrote numbers beside categories: women, captives, religious, for transport, unfit, older, younger. The ledger did not know Magdalena's fear. It did not know Sister Damaris's voice. It did not know the abbess had hidden a chalice beneath the chapel floor. It knew only that human beings could be reduced to entries in a column. This was where official erasure began. The sisters were placed below deck with other captives: Greeks, Serbs, Italians, and Christians from places the ship's crew did not bother to pronounce correctly. The hold smelled of damp wood, salt, wool, sickness, and fear. A narrow strip of light fell through a hatch above them, then vanished when night came. For 12 days, according to the shape of the story that survived, the ship moved toward Constantinople. The sea took away the mountains first, then it took away the shore, then it took away the last visible proof that the nuns had belonged to a place at all. Below deck, orders came from above in a language some captives understood and others did not. Food was handed down, water was rationed. No one asked for stories. No one asked what names had been spoken over them at birth or at vows. Captivity began by controlling movement, but it deepened by making the past feel useless. One night, when even the guards seemed tired, Magdalena whispered the beginning of a psalm. Her voice was so thin it could have broken under the ship's creaking beams. But another prisoner heard her, then another. The words were incomplete, carried by memory rather than a book. Yet in the dark, the broken psalm became something more than prayer. It became proof that a name could be taken from a register and still live in a mouth. At dawn on the final day, Constantinople rose from the water. The city appeared first as walls, then domes, then smoke, then the pale shape of towers against the morning. For some captives, it was the city of old Christian emperors, the city whose fall had changed the world. For others, it was now the Ottoman capital, living under a new order, its streets filled with soldiers, merchants, officials, craftsmen, and pilgrims of another empire. The nuns saw Hagia Sophia from a distance. Once the great church of Byzantine glory, it now stood under Ottoman rule. Its vast dome remained, but the meaning around it had changed. History had not erased the building. It had changed what the building was allowed to say. An older nun near Magdalena whispered, "We have come home to a city that no longer knows us." That sentence stayed with the survivors longer than the voyage. From the harbor, they were moved through guarded spaces, courtyards, and streets where no one could tell if the people watching them felt pity, curiosity, contempt, or nothing at all. The city was too large to care. Its stones had seen emperors rise, armies enter, churches become something else, and languages replace one another in the marketplace. By the time the nuns were brought before imperial authority, they had learned that conquest could be calm. The chamber was marble, cool, and arranged with terrifying order. Scribes sat with registers, translators stood ready. A senior Ottoman official, remembered in the story as a grand vizier or a man of similar rank, received reports with the weariness of someone who had processed many lives before theirs. The nuns were not treated as women from a sacred house. They were treated as a problem to be organized. Names were requested, ages were guessed, skills were noted, strength was judged. Their vows were described as an obstacle. Their language was translated into administrative inconvenience. Then came the offer that power often calls mercy. They could accept new names. They could accept instruction. They could receive food, protection, and a place in service. They could live if they agreed to become legible to the empire in the way the empire demanded. Sister Damaris stepped forward as far as the guards allowed. She was old, thin, and straight-backed. Her face had the stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime learning when not to speak. When she finally did, the chamber seemed to tighten. "You may rename us," she said, "but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The translator gave the words to the official. For a moment, the Grand Vizier studied her. Then he replied with a sentence colder than anger. "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." That was the midpoint of the story, and it matters that you understand it clearly. The deepest danger was no longer the blade, the march, or the sea. It was the belief that identity could be worn down until even the person carrying it became tired of defending it. The order was given. The nuns were not executed in the square. They were not returned. They were not allowed the clean ending of martyrdom. They were sent below. And beneath the palace, mercy became another kind of prison. The underground chambers beneath the palace did not need chains everywhere to feel like captivity. Stone did most of the work. Light entered only through narrow slits high above the floor. The air smelled of oil, damp cloth, brass, and old smoke. Above them, palace moved with ritual and command. Beneath it, the nameless worked where history rarely looked. The nuns were taken out of their monastic robes without ceremony. A garment that had once marked vow, discipline, community, and belonging was treated like dirty cloth. In its place, they were given rough servant garments, plain and practical. The dark veil became a memory. The small signs of their old life were removed until the mirror, when one was available, gave back strangers. Then came the numbers. Not all records survive, and the story must be told with caution. But fragments and later traditions agree on the meaning. The women were entered into systems that preferred categories to souls. Their names were shortened, changed, forbidden, or ignored. What mattered was that they answer, and this was the true breaking point. Not the burning convent, not the road, not the ship. Those had been terrors that came from outside. This was slower, this entered the mind. Day after day, the empire did not need to shout that the convent was gone. It proved it by refusing to say its name. It did not need to kill every sister. It needed only to make each surviving sister wake, work, eat, sleep, and rise again inside a world where her vows had no public meaning. They washed linens, polished brass, tended fires, sewed garments, and cleaned floors walked by men who had never heard of their convent. Some were questioned, some were given extra bread after obedience, some were left in silence after refusal. Hunger, kindness, darkness, promises, and exhaustion came in cycles. That was the cruelty of it. Mercy became pressure. Food became persuasion. Survival became a test. Remember this. Power does not always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it arrives with a register, a clean robe, a new name, and a bowl of soup placed before a starving woman on the condition that she stop remembering who she was. Some captives submitted. Hunger can bend the strongest will. Loneliness can make surrender feel like rest. They disappeared into the palace system, not always through death, but through absorption. The remaining sisters grew quieter. At first, the guards thought silence meant defeat. It meant fear. It meant exhaustion. It meant these women had learned their place beneath the stone. Then Sister Damaris was asked again what she should be called. She looked at the official, then to the scribe's waiting pen. "Call me Silence," she said. The sentence traveled farther than she did. Among guards, it became irritation. Among servants, it became rumor. Among the remaining sisters, it became a vow. If names could be punished, silence would carry them. If prayers could not be spoken aloud, silence would hold the shape of them. If the empire wanted an answer, the refusal to answer became the last territory the women controlled. Magdalena, once the youngest and most frightened, became the one who remembered for the others. She remembered the bells, the bread oven, Sister Eleni's silver crucifix, and the line spoken before the gate broke. When another woman's courage thinned, Magdalena whispered it beside her in the dark. "If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other." Then came the hidden chapel. It was discovered not with triumph, but by accident. A loose draft of air near a sealed archway, a stone that did not sit like the others, a servant passage no one had used in years. Behind it was a forgotten chamber, low and narrow, with dust gathered in the corners and a ceiling blackened by older smoke. What mattered was what the women made of it. They used broken pottery as candle holders. They laid a scrap of linen across a flat stone as an altar cloth. A crude cross was shaped from wood, mirror shard, or whatever the chamber gave them. There was no bell, no choir, no open book, no painted icon watching from the wall. There were only tired women in rough garments, standing where no official thought to look. At night, after the palace slept, they gathered there. They did not always sing hymns. Songs could carry through stone. Instead, they whispered memories. A garden in Thessaly, rain on a roof, sandals before dawn, warm bread, and the bells. And in that hidden chamber, memory became worship. Magdalena began marking the wall because names were dangerous. Bird for each living sister. A small flame for each one lost, transferred, absorbed, or never seen again. Crosses were scratched with careful hands into the stone. The marks were small, almost childish, but they formed a record no clerk had authorized. Then someone carved a phrase. The light shines in the darkness. No one knows who first cut it there. The letters were uneven, half erased by later damage. But tradition says the phrase remained long after the voices had stopped. Years passed. Or perhaps only months passed and suffering made them feel like years. This is where the official record becomes weak. Ledgers often preserve taxes better than tears, but when powerless people vanish, records often grow vague. A name becomes an entry. An entry becomes a number becomes a gap. Some women were marked unfit for service, some were moved without destination. Some disappeared behind phrases that did not care who they had been. Where a life should have been, there was ink, absence, or nothing at all. This is how history erases people without needing to deny that they existed. Magdalena's last trace is not found in a clean document. It survives as rumor. A palace servant, old enough to have heard too much and young enough then to remember it, later spoke of women beneath the stone who prayed without sound. Another fragment spoke of a hymn heard through a wall after midnight. Another mentioned markings in a sealed lower chamber, birds, flames, crosses, and a sentence about light. Centuries later, travelers, monks, archivists, and servants repeated versions of the forbidden story. Some details changed as all whispered histories change. The number of sisters shifted, the names blurred, the dates were argued over, but the center remained. A convent had fallen, the women had been taken. The empire had tried to turn them into service, numbers, silence, and forgotten labor. And the stone remembered what the ink did not. This story is not remembered because the nuns defeated an army. They did not regain their convent. They did not return in procession through the gates of Thessaly. They did not see justice pronounced in a marble court. Many of them disappeared into the kind of silence that historians fear most. The silence created when power decides a person is not worth recording. Yet that is why the story endures. Because what was worse than death was not only captivity. It was being forced to live while every public sign of the self was taken away. Home removed, robes removed, names altered, vows mocked, work assigned, speech controlled, records emptied, memory pushed underground until even prayer had to hide in stone, and still something remained. Phrase, a rumor, a bird scratched into a wall, a small flame carved for someone no ledger properly mourned, a hidden chapel made from broken pottery, scrap linen, and exhausted faith. A young nun who became old in the dark and taught others that memory could survive where documents failed. They were buried beneath an empire, but they were not erased. And if you have stayed with this story to the end, remember the caution it leaves behind. History is not only what rulers write down. Sometimes history is what the powerless carve quietly into the places where no one thinks to look. Convent bells stopped ringing centuries ago, but beneath the stone, their silence was still speaking.